Oh yes, I will record this. Oh, you got it. I'm clearly with it. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna get started. For people in chat, if you have any questions, or people online, I mean, if you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat. Just as a quick check, am I like clear? Like, can people online hear me well? Hello, Harris. If you can't hear me well, just, oh, cool. Thanks, Anthony. Awesome. So I will get started. Um, so yeah. Okay, so welcome to the VS Code Dev Containers workshop. Uh, thanks for everyone for making it. I know the weather outside is very crazy, so it's understandable for people not to show. I'll hide this out of the way. So yes, my name is Emil Harvey. I'm a third-year student here. That's all about me. So let's talk about what we are going to do today. So the first kind of prerequisite steps is to install Docker and VS Code if you haven't done so already. I won't be doing that today just because it will take a lot of time. So be sure to do that. Next, we're going to just talk a little bit about dev containers, like what they are, like the benefits of them. And then we're going to briefly explore them and see like why they're very useful. And then after that, we're just going to quickly touch on some like good practices to have, and we'll end off with some like related topics to explore. Say like you're very interested in this whole dev container stuff. I'll share some like additional topics to look at as well. So with that said, here are some quick setup steps. I'll go ahead and copy these links to the chat. But basically, you will want to install Visual Studio Code. It's not the same as Visual Studio. Hey, so make sure you have VS Code installed. And then you also want to install Docker. Keep in mind, Docker will want you to restart. So keep that in mind. Hey, hello. We've just gotten started, so you haven't missed much. Yeah, and so after you install Docker, you want to install this remote extension pack. I'll walk through this specifically because it's a little weird, but basically when you open VS Code, you'll want to search for this little weird thing, ID, but I'll go through that later, and that's very short. Awesome. So if people are getting those stuff installed, I'll talk quickly about what dev containers are. So dev containers are like development environments that you can work inside with VS Code. And so what we mean by an environment is like, basically you'll have all of the software and stuff you'll need to work on software. And it uses containers, right? So that's why if you're not aware, Docker is a thing that runs containers, and you can think of containers as virtual machines. Some people might say they're not the same thing, but it's very helpful to think of them as virtual machines. And so what that means is within Docker, you'll have like a tiny little like operating system, right? So you'll be running Windows, but then in VS Code and Docker, you'll have like a little Linux container thing, and that little miniature virtual machine will have everything you'll need to install things. So a good analogy would be to compare it to things like pip or npm or conda. If you don't know what those are, basically say you're like writing some Python, right? And you're writing Python and you want to make a web app. So you might install this thing called Flask. You don't need to know what Flask is. All you need to know is it's some code that some other person wrote, and it lets you write web apps. So Python lets you kind of manage these, what we call them, dependencies. And so basically, when you install Flask, you can kind of write those requirements to a file, and then say somebody else wants to work on your project with you, they can also install Flask using this file. So that's kind of like the similarity. Dev containers are similar to that, but instead of just working with like one language or even a set of language, it's on like an operating system scale. So I'm running Windows on my laptop, but when I use dev containers, I'm actually kind of developing in Linux, right? So I'm developing inside like a Linux virtual machine. And what's special about this Linux virtual machine is that it's defined by a JSON file that you can stick on a repo or something. And so basically, I could send this JSON file out to all my team members. They can use dev containers, and they'll have kind of the exact same system that I'm using, right? So really, really cool. And you'll have all of the required software. You can put like startup scripts, etc. And it'll work fine. So here's like a little diagram of how dev containers work. So this whole like blue box, think of it as like my laptop, right? And on my laptop, I installed VS Code, right? So it's just regular old VS Code. It's a little text editor thing. I can type stuff in and save it. And then I also installed Docker over here, right? And what VS Code is going to do is it's going to use Docker and kind of manage it for us. And it'll manage these little containers, right? And you can see in this picture, I have 4, right? And what VS Code can do is it can connect to the container. And so then all of my developments in this container, right? So going back to that web app example, this dev container will have Flask, it'll have Python installed. You know, say I want to like use 20 different languages as well, right? I can modify the dev container to include those languages, and it'll just work, right? And you can see I have multiple dev containers. So generally what you'll see is you'll have one dev container per project. Last term I worked on 2 projects, and I had 2 dev containers, right? One for the one project and one for the other. And what's really neat about it is VS Code doesn't care about if you're using any other dev containers. You could have 2 windows of VS Code open, and they could be connected to different containers. So it's really, really flexible that way. So I talked a little bit about the benefits, but I just really want to hammer in the point of like, what's the point? Like, why do we care about dev containers? And really, it avoids problems that happen due to inconsistency. And you will be surprised how often this happens. This week, one of my profs showed me this software called Oscar EMR. And Oscar EMR is like a application that like doctors use. I actually used it a long time ago as a receptionist. So I like scan documents in and I click buttons and stuff. And you can tell it's a very old application. And when you look at the source code, there is no like clear way to know how to even run this thing, right? So like I say I want to like contribute to Oscar, I don't really know how to like start it or to build it or anything. And so what you often find is like 2 developers will have vastly different setups. So yeah, not very good. But dev containers use a JSON file to configure itself. So that means it's very reproducible. And not only that, because dev containers use a JSON file, you can stick this JSON file onto a Git repository, and you get all of the benefits of Git. So last week we had a workshop on Git, and we talked about things like traceability, and we can use branches and stuff. And dev containers work really well with that. And it uses JSON files on purpose because of that. And lastly, dev containers allow for specialization. So last term on my projects, I was the person who worried about the dev environments. So I configured the dev containers. Obviously, dev containers aren't perfect. There's a lot of problems with it. But once I got it working, I could just send that out to my team members, and they could test it. And not only that, they could work on like Java projects or Python projects, and they didn't need to even worry about installing Java or Python or anything like that. And the last note I put here is that the JSON file is a great source of documentation. Documentation can be very vague because often it's in English, right? So if I said, oh, step 1 is to update, do I mean to update your Python packages? Do I mean to update your operating system, or do I mean to like update your branch, right? But with JSON files and with VS Code, it's very like stringent and very strict. So basically, it'll either 100% work or not work at all. And so even though that's kind of like seems scary, it's better than getting unclear instructions and just trying to figure out what to do. So yeah. So getting started, what you'll want to do is open VS Code and look at the Remote Explorer extension. So hopefully at this point, everyone has gotten VS Code installed. I'll go through and walk through this.
Actually, Docker is being downloaded.
Oh.
Docker is huge file.
Yeah, Docker is very huge.
600 MB. So, and this Wi-Fi is not working great.
Yeah, no, that's understandable, and that is like a bit of a concern we have with Devcontainers.
College has to address something.
For sure, yeah. I did install VS Code and Docker beforehand, hopefully, so hopefully this all works. But we will have a recording for this to like follow through. Yeah, so I'll just get started here. I'm just going to create a new window. And what I'll do is I'll show you where the link, like how to install the remote extension pack. So after you install VS Code and Docker, you want to look for this thing called a remote development pack. It's actually a bundle of extensions, but they're all very useful. So you notice I just copied and pasted this little bolded text here. I did stick it in the chat. So if you stick it, so we go down here, go to extensions, and then paste it in, you'll see this remote development pack, and you see I'll have it already installed. So yeah, and it says it wants to reload, so I'll do that. Cool. So if you go back to the instructions, it will say something about going to the Remote Explorer and then clicking the plus. So what does that mean? Well, what we want to do is go down here and go to the Remote Explorer. And you can see it's loading because that's what Docker is, a bunch of loading. And you can see I have some dev containers going on, but I'll just show you how to create a new one. So I'll go over and click this plus. It's going to ask me a bunch of different things.
Can you just reshare?
Oh, yes. Am I not sharing?
You are. Some people are just saying unable to see this.
Oh, I am sorry. Okay. I did encounter this before. It's weird. Okay. Maybe I can just... Well, actually, I will share my entire screen. Okay. Is this visible to everyone? Cool. Gavin is monitoring the chat, so if it's not visible, say something, and then I will try again. Cool. So just to recap the last few steps, I installed the Remote Explorer extension by searching for it, and then you can see there's this little tab over here. So I clicked on this tab, and then up top, you want to make sure this is selected to containers. And then I just click plus. And what I'm going to do is open a folder in a container, just because I want to open an empty folder. I'll go to GitHub. You can see I have a folder already there, but I'll make another one. I'll say dev container workshop. And it's just an empty folder. And as an aside, like when you're dealing with software projects, it's nice to use folders. It's also easy to forget to do so. So I clicked open and nothing happened, and that's okay. Because what VS Code is asking me is to say, like, what kind of configuration template do I want to use? And what I want to use is Debian, because I know Debian. But you can see there's a lot of different options. Some of them are like purpose built, like something for Anaconda. Some of them are very simple, like Alpine Linux. And some of them, well, a lot of them are Azure related. But I just want to use Debian because it's simple. So I'll just click this. It's going to ask me like what version. I don't really care, so I'm just going to use the default. And then it's going to ask me about these things about features. You can think of features as like little add-ons. So I have so Debian Linux is like an operating system. It's just like basically, it's kind of like Windows. But I can add on things like Anaconda or Apache or Astro CLI, whatever that is. But I'm not going to install that or worry about that now. I'm just going to click OK. And then more loading will happen. Hello. So I'm just going to click to trust the folder because I just created it. So I do trust it. It has nothing in it. And you can see VS Code is doing a bunch of stuff, right? And you can, if you like pay attention to this, you can see it's doing a lot of Docker related stuff, right? So basically what VS Code is doing is it's creating the container for me. Now, if you're following along and doing this at home, you'll probably see a lot of stuff about downloading stuff because it has to download Debian Linux first. But I did this beforehand just so that we can move forward, and because the Wi-Fi here can be slow sometimes. I'm just going to check the chat. Make sure it's all good. Cool. And one thing to note is that VS Code asked me all those questions at the beginning, like about Debian and about features, because I had opened an empty folder. What you will see in a second is that VS Code is going to create this file, this JSON file, and that JSON file is going to reflect all of the decisions I made. So that way I can just send that file over, and VS Code won't ask me that question anymore. It will just straight up go for it. So now we can tell we're in a dev container because on the bottom left it says dev container. And you can also see this dev container JSON file. So you can see that it's the Debian Linux, like Bullseye, whatever. Bullseye just refers to the version. And you can see like there's a lot of other things to configure. But we'll get through most of those later. The thing I do want to point out is I'm using Visual Studio Code for Windows, right? It's not like the Linux app, it's just the Windows app. But if I was to go and create a new terminal, which takes a while, you can see that it's actually a Linux terminal now. So this is the cool thing, is that I can run Linux commands like echo or sudo apt update, and it's basically as if I'm not sitting in front of a Linux machine, or I'm not sitting in front of a Windows machine, and I'm sitting in front of a Linux machine. So it's really, really great to have. I think a question might be, are there Windows-based containers? And the answer is no. It's only for Linux. Cool. So that's just like the basics. That's just how to create a container. I'm just going to move on a bit and talk a bit about that configuration. So we noticed that there is this devcontainer.json file. And you can configure it, right? You can change the values, and it'll do different things. So for example, we could change the base image. This is very Docker specific stuff, and there is a Docker workshop coming up. So don't worry about this too much, but you can just think of the base image as kind of like the base that it downloads, right? If you know about Windows, like golden images or anything like that, it's the same idea. In this case, I downloaded a Debian image, so it's basically just Debian Linux and nothing installed. But you could create your own images and then use that instead. You can also configure something called features. Features are a dev container specific thing, and they are just like little add-ons people make, usually Microsoft, that you can like stick in to your container. And lastly, you can do stuff like startup scripts. So startup scripts are like, say you want to run apt update, right, which is a Linux command. Then you can just stick that on a startup script and it'll run it all the time. Now, an important thing to know is you will likely want to modify your dev container periodically. And when you do so, you want to rebuild the container after modifying it, because that will reflect your changes. So, for example, maybe I will go over here, and maybe I would want to run a startup command. So first thing I'll do is add a comment here, because I always forget. And then in VS Code, if I just start with some quotation marks in the dev container file, you can see it's going to give me some suggestions, which is nice. And I'll do something like post start command, And I'll do something simple, like echo hello world. So this is just a command. So if I was to copy this and make a little terminal and paste it, echo hello world just prints out hello world to the screen, right? There it is. So I put this as a post start command. So basically what this means is that I can put my mouse over it. It's a command to run after starting the container. So if I save this file and then over here it says that if I do Control-Shift-P, I can type in commands. So if I did Control-Shift-P, I could type in rebuild. So Control-Shift-P is like a VS Code like shortcut to bring up this little command thing. So I do Control-Shift-P, and then I type in rebuild, and then here's the devcontainers rebuild container. So if I did this, and I cross my fingers, what VS Code is going to do is it's going to recreate my dev container for me. And so it's going to go through a lot of the steps before, but right at the end, what we'll see is it'll say echo hello world, which might take a little while, but yeah, you can use these configurations to like add in different languages or like add in different features. You also might have saw some stuff about like exposing ports. But the great thing is here is that post start command. So post start command here, post start command here, and it just says hello world. So success, right? It's a very simple example and it doesn't really do anything, but you can think, the more you know about like Linux administration or like different commands, the more you can kind of configure your dev container to kind of build itself, right? So like a popular one might be like sudo apt update or something, right? And I'll just like update the package files and stuff. Awesome. And again, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them eventually. Cool. So that's just kind of like a run through of all the configuration things. I'm going to delve in a bit deeper into features. So features are like the little startup scripts, but instead of me like typing in each like script by hand, features are like, say you want to run, install Python, right? As a simple example. What Microsoft has done is it's packaged a few scripts together to add Python to your container. And so you can do more complicated things. You can usually recreate these or replicate these features yourselves. Say if you know a lot about Linux and you want to like delve in with each command that you want to run, you could certainly do that. But you'll notice things here like you could have Kubernetes run in a dev container, or you could have Docker run inside your dev container, which itself is a container, right? So there are some pretty complicated features. So it does make sense to use them. The important thing to know is the dev container features can be found here on this repository. And I'll post this repository in the chat. So if you take a look at this repository, the other thing to note is to look at the source folder. But if you look in this repository and go to source, we can see all of the available features. So for example, say we want to get Java. We could go to the Java folder and they have like a little README. So the example, so it has example usage. And this is basically just something to stick in your dev container JSON file. So I can go here. I'll add another comma here just to make it proper JSON. And you can see this is features things that have been commented out. And what I'm going to do is copy and paste this thing in here. And you can see that this modification would add Java to my container. And you can see that there are a lot of other version options too. And those options would be placed here. But I'm just going to stick with the basics, and I just say, oh, I just want Java. So I can add this snippet in here, and then if I run Control-Shift-P and I rebuild the container, VS Code is going to do that whole process again. But this time at the end, we'll see that Java was installed, which is pretty cool. I'm just going to let that run for a minute because it's going to take a while. And I'll just get started with the slides again. I already talked about startup scripts, right? The thing I want to highlight is that startup scripts, base images, features, they can kind of all accomplish the same things. Startup scripts are nice because you can configure them to always run on startup, though they will kind of require some Linux admin or administration knowledge, just because you're typing in bash commands or Linux commands. But they can be great ways to just do simple things, right? So like upgrading pip stuff or upgrading other stuff, all very useful. My screen froze again. Oh God. Stuck on the feature screen. I am so sorry, everyone. I will share my screen. I'm going to share. I do have to share the screen to show VS Code. I do apologize. And thank you for notifying me. Hopefully hopefully we should be on good practices. Good practices, confidently. But let me know if I'm not. So that's kind of just like the quick and dirty about VS Code dev containers. I'm just going to talk quickly about some good practices. So one thing that will kind of be a repetitive problem is things about line end encodings. So basically the crux of it is whenever you want to do like a new line or like basically like here, right? So like in between this one line and to the next line, Windows and Linux and Mac have different ways of encoding it. So basically Windows uses 2 characters for every new line, but Unix only uses 1. Not usually a problem. However, say I'm on Windows and I clone the repository in Windows, and then I open that folder in the dev container. That folder was cloned by Windows, so the line endings will have the 2 characters. However, I just opened it up in a dev container, which is Linux-based, and Linux will generally be okay with that. However, I noticed like Python, for example, will get really mad at you if you have that different encoding. So one way around that is to use volumes. And I'll show that off really quickly. So hopefully, please let me know. Oh my gosh. So there was an error with this. I did encounter this earlier. So basically, this error is from me adding Java to the container, which is weird because I had done that last year. The same error too. Interesting. Okay, so if you encounter an error with features, one thing that's useful to do is you could make a GitHub issue about it. We could even Google it, see if it's anything Java related. So here we go. Dev containers with features are failing to build. Unfortunate. So yeah, they're not perfect, but dev containers is an open source standard. So say you're using dev containers and you run into an issue, you could go to the dev containers like GitHub page thing and then make an issue. But that's for a different time. What we're going to do is talk about line encodings. So instead of worrying about this dev container stuff, I'm just going to remove this features because it didn't work. But just believe me when I say that they do usually work. So while that's going over here, I'm going to open another Visual Studio thing. And just to get back on track and to remind people what we're supposed to be doing, we're talking about this line end encodings thing and how Windows uses 2 characters and Unix uses 1. So one way around that is to use dev volumes, which basically means that instead of opening a folder in the dev container, VS Code can directly clone a repository for you. So this means that your code has to be living on a repository. However, the upside is the dev volumes will try to make sure that it won't have any issues due to Windows versus Linux file encodings or anything like that. So to do that, I can go to new container. I can clone a repository. I'll show that a bit more clearly. So if I click the plus, and then I can click clone repository in container volume. It only supports GitHub for now, which is weird because it's a Microsoft product. But I can click that, and then it's going to, if you do this for the first time, it might ask you to authenticate against GitHub. But I already did that, and you can see I have all sorts of different things that I can clone. So for example, one of my labs, I'll clone. And it'll just, I think I just accidentally exited out. Or, oh my gosh, sign in with the browser. This did not happen before. Okay, there we go. So create new volume. I'm just going to call it labs. Target folder name. I'm not sure why it asked me all those questions. I don't really care. But now I'm cloning this repository. However, I'm not cloning it to a regular Windows folder. I'm letting Docker handle where that repository gets cloned to, and I will just close my ears and not care where it's going. Yeah, so you can see it's doing the same thing. So I won't let it persist. But once it's cloned, all the file encodings and stuff will not be a worry for me. Cool. I'm going to go back to the slides. I feel like this screen sharing issue happens when I'm switching between slides, so do let me know if you can't see the slides. Right now I'm on good practices, and so we just talked about using volumes to fix line encoding issues. Another way is to use Git attributes, which is kind of an advanced Git thing, so I won't talk about it too much, but you can just Google Git attributes and it'll give you some information. Moving on for good practices, and it might sound like this is should just be intuitive or should be common knowledge, but you really want to automate everything. Don't have a dev container that okay, you clone it and it builds, but then you have to type in one more command or something. Because from my experience and from some literature I've been reading, it's a slippery slope, right? You'll start with just one command that you need to enter when you start the dev container, and then that'll move to 2 and so forth. And then it'll be just as bad as that Oscar EMR stuff where I still do not know how to start developing on that project. So do try to automate everything where possible. And we saw that there's kind of multiple ways to do that, right? The features, presumably that they work, the startup scripts, which do work more often, and the base image as well. Also, it's helpful to work on dev containers like any other code. So that it can be tempting to think, okay, what is my project going to ever need? And maybe for example, I'm doing the solution challenge. So maybe I'll be okay, we're gonna probably use SQL and probably use Flutter and stuff. And you might get into that train of thinking okay, I need to make my dev container complete right off the bat, and that won't ever work. Instead, treat it like any other code, right? Increments, use small increments, use iterations, do lots of testing. One thing that I did last term was I used a lot of branches. So we had a project that we had to maintain. And at first I had tried to use one build tool, and then I wanted to switch over. So I just created another branch and then basically created a whole new dev container JSON. And that was fine because, again, it's just a file. I just basically told my team members, hey, check out this branch, clone the repo, rebuild the container, and see if it's working or not, right? So you can be very drastic in that, and that's the last point. You can totally swap out your build tools or totally swap out what language you're using because it's all defined and contained in that dev container stuff, right? And that kind of goes back to why it's so important to automate everything. So this is towards the end. So now that we've talked a bit about dev containers, where do we go from here? The first thing is, if you're not familiar with JSON or YAML, it is very, very useful to know. They are very like buzzwordy now, and I think sometimes that can be like a little intimidating to be like, oh, I need to learn all of these acronyms. But JSON and YAML are just ways to like describe things, right? Like describe data. So if I look at the dev container JSON, I'll just create a new window. Then if I look at the dev container JSON, right, you can, you don't really need to be like an expert in JSON. You can kind of like figure things out as you go along. But like, of course, learning more about it is always helpful. I'm going to just open this folder again. I apologize. There we go. So as that opening, I'll talk about the other things. There are other kind of VS Code specific configuration. So specifically, this is there's a .vs Code folder that you can look at. The thing to note is that is totally separate from dev containers. Dev containers and like VS Code specific configuration, you might see some overlap, but technically they are separate. So you can look into that. Docker, right? So we talked about how VS Code uses Docker. Now, throughout this workshop, you don't really need to know anything about Docker, and that's fine. However, it could be helpful, especially if you get into more advanced cases. Say you want to build your own images. Docker is always a good tool to look at. And so is basic Linux administration, right? I showed how we can use like startup scripts to run Linux commands. The more you know about Linux administration, the better. And across industry, you will see that Linux is kind of already taken over. And because it's open source and because it's so configurable, it's very helpful to know. Build tool chains is also helpful to know. And this is kind of all supporting an emerging trend. So something you can Google is a thing called platform engineering. It's very similar to DevOps. The similarities are that they're both basically buzzwords, but platform engineering is all about building tools to support development. So things like dev containers and even Docker, right? They are kind of moving towards a field where your job is not to build products, but to help other people build products, right? And you can see how dev containers are a really good fit for that, because if I go to the dev container JSON, right, I could be like a super big expert in like Linux and build tools and like that kind of like CI/CD stuff. But my team doesn't, like the rest of my team doesn't need to even care, right? Because all of my like knowledge is transferred to the dev container JSON, which is shared with everyone, and all they have to do is start up the application and run it. And so yeah, that's basically it. I know it was a little bit short, but do you want to ask if there's any questions? No, that is
I was
okay.
wondering that I initially thought that Devcontainer has same concept to the Docker containers.
Yeah, so I can tell you like there are a lot of similarities with them.
Yeah.
Though containers themselves, so like the kind of context is that containers have become like the way a lot of organizations like deliver applications. So for example, Google uses containers. They use that thing called Kubernetes, which runs a ton, like millions and millions and millions of containers. And that's what's running like Gmail and like Google Drive and all of those like little microservice type things. However, like, so that's like why containers like were invented. However, we then saw that like, wait, why are we just limiting to that, right? And so basically VS Code, like dev containers are like repurposing traditional containers for developers. Yeah. Does that make sense?
And yeah, so for even for development process, So I was like, why do I have to open the folder in this extension? Like, can I not just have current folder opened in that?
Yeah,
But it is totally separate, right?
yeah. So you could for sure like just like manage your own containers and then connect to them, and it's actually not that hard to do. Dev containers are just like basically Microsoft and a few like other industry people were like, everyone's going to do this. Might as well have like an easy standard. So if I go back to the GitHub, um, this GitHub organization is like basically just like they're not really building software or anything. They're just saying this is the standard. It's dev containers. Like everyone's going to want to like use dev containers, so might as well like have a standard. Currently, like VS Code is the only application that like really uses it, but you could expect in the future more like other things will start to use dev
I'm
containers.
starting to
So
understand it. Like, it's like not my Windows machine. It has changed to whatever I chose. Like, it's Alpine now. I'm running on Alpine, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So all of my extensions are gone because they are not available in that. Okay.
Mhm.
Got it.
There's
Yeah.
a question in the chat.
Sure.
I also have a question.
What would be the next steps to run a program inside a container through VS Code? That's a great question, and it does depend on A, your type of application, and B, how you want to run it. So I'll actually open up an old project. This is my project from last term. So I'll show you like if I can open it. My laptop's so slow. Um, So basically, to run a program through VS Code, the easiest solution would be like a web app. And web apps very easy to run in VS Code because and through dev containers because your dev container can expose a port. If you know about Docker, you know that Docker can also expose network ports, but VS Code can do that as well. Um, so hit preload this. So I'll wait for this to load. But basically, what you'll do for a web app is you just like set up a startup script to run the web app, and then VS Code will actually like say, hey, this you have an application running on this port. Do you want to access it? And you'll say yes. And then what VS Code will let you do is connect to that web application through your web browser. So that's one option. Now, my hunch is that you're talking maybe about like a desktop application, which can be a lot trickier. And I'm not actually, that's not my level of expertise. I think Gavin and I were in a project last term, and we talked about how to run desktop apps, and we basically decided, let's not do that. However, if you were, like, say you really had to run a desktop app, what you could do is look for a dev container feature called Desktop Lite, which adds a lightweight desktop to the container that you can access through VNC or the web. So basically what this little lightweight desktop feature will do is it'll create like a Linux desktop that you could run through your web browser. And then from there, you can run the application. Now, that is just like a very high level description. It's quite a bit more work to do it in practice, but it is possible. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. No worries. Yeah. Like just to like reiterate, like dev containers and that kind of stuff is like it's a hot topic, right? And so is platform engineering. I think I read somewhere like by 2026, like most big tech companies will have a specialized platform engineering team. So this is very like hot like software to learn. Not very like not as useful for like say me as an individual, like just working on my own personal stuff. But you can think for like organizations like I spent my last co-op, they basically said, okay, your first month is just figuring out how to run this thing, right? Which is obviously a lot of waste of time for a 4-month co-op, right? So something like dev containers would have been very helpful there. Yeah, so actually, just to go back, just to kind of finalize the thing, Here I have like my attendance app. So this was like a project I did for project last term. And what you'll see if it runs is it's still like going through scripts, so I apologize. But I can basically I can configure VS Code. So this is kind of like where I was talking about the difference between like dev container configuration and VS Code configuration. So one thing to just to end off on is also look at how VS Code handles things, because it's very configurable. For example, I can like define how I want to launch my web server, and it'll just work. So, and in this case, I'll just run the web server. I'll click run, and it'll complain at me. Wow, this is insane because I literally just tried this just before this workshop. But I'll just wave my hands and say that usually it will just work.
I do
Yeah.
have a project.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. So I do not mean to step in your spot.
No worries.
Could you go into your web browser
Mm-hmm.
and type in recommending movies? So I made this this side project that actually it was my first time using Docker, and it's a like machine learning little like app that takes in a movie and spits out something that is like recommended based on its based on like natural language processing of its like description and stuff. It has to be movies from prior.
Oh no.
Oh,
Hey,
okay.
I found it.
Okay. Yeah. So how I structured it is I had three Docker containers. I had one that had Nginx, which is like a reverse proxy, which is very simple to use. It is just like another JSON or scripting file. And then my Python app, and then my React app. And all it did was just use, like if you've learned REST, it just used like REST APIs to communicate with each other. And that's essentially what you're saying here is like the power of containers is you're able to have a communication like that on different microservices. So if one of those services go down, like let's just say like my machine learning Docker goes down, I can boot something up, or even in development, I'm able to swap that out for a different like machine learning program or something like that easily without having to go into the other code and fixing it and that sort of thing. So that's one sort of application that I found with like Docker, and I know we're going to talk about dev containers, but they're very closely related.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like there's a reason why like, historically it was like you'll just install the application on like a physical computer and then never touch that computer for the rest of the time. And then we thought that's not very sustainable, so we moved to virtual machines. But then that was still not as efficient. So now we're on containers, which are a lot more efficient. Obviously, like as we've seen today, there's still a lot of downloading involved. So it's not perfect. Like the hint is there's a new trend called serverless, which is a whole nother topic, which might be the answer. But yeah, I'm just going to go back to here because I was wondering if, oh my gosh, it's still saying it's activating the extension. So yeah, obviously there's like concerns with that, with the dev container stuff. Part of it is because it's running on my laptop and my laptop is very slow. So that's just how it goes. But yeah, one thing I will kind of mention, like a new thing that's coming out is things like GitHub code spaces. GitHub code spaces still uses dev containers. However, instead of me running VS Code and running Docker and stuff, dev containers or code spaces run on the web. So, and I actually used something similar to code spaces last term. So instead of like people starting on VS Code and stuff, they could just log onto a website and start developing. So there's things like code spaces, Git pods are another one. And actually, I believe as a student, you get some code spaces credit. I think they like give you a few hours, maybe like 180 hours per month or something. But internally, they still use Devcontainers. So that's another great thing, is that now we can have web-based IDEs and VS Code and presumably other like whatever applications, and they all use Devcontainers JSON, so they all kind of work together. So it's very like cohesive that way. And this thing is, I'm going to give up on this. Python will never load. So yeah. Docker dev environments. Yeah, I believe, like, I'm sure, yeah. So Docker kind of, this is a bit of a side, but Docker kind of had a bit of like an identity crisis because a thing called Kubernetes came out, which basically wiped out Docker's whole like business model. So what Docker is really focused in now is on developer experience. So I think Anthony mentioned something about dev environments. So if I'm in the Docker desktop app and there's a thing called dev environments, and I've never tried this, but it is another thing to try too. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I think there's a few things on the chat. Architecture, yeah. Yeah, and kind of going back to Docker, you can run Docker within a dev container. I mentioned this like briefly, but for example, in this repository for my group project, I have like a little Docker file. So this will be something I'll do at my next workshop on Docker. But basically, you can don't think that, oh, just because I'm using dev environments means I can't use Docker within that, right? You can, anything's possible basically. And so dev containers are very useful in basically collecting everything that you possibly need for a project and sticking it all together. So it could be Kubernetes, it could be Docker, it could even be like MySQL server, right? Because you could just install that on Linux. So yeah. Any other questions or concerns or anything? Cool. Okay, I do have a survey. You do not have to answer it, but the feedback will be very helpful. So I will post this to the chat, and I just realized that I'm not sure how to send it to the rest of everyone.
If you make a new tab and post the thing and then put QR in front of it, and Firefox allows. That's okay. Yeah, at the front.
Like.
Yeah, and then like QR.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Then you make a QR code. Will not make a QR code.
Okay, I'm going to make a QR code, guys. That's sure.
Awesome. Okay, so while he is doing that, I also just wanted to mention about next week's events and sort of the upcoming events too. So next Monday, we have a developer who does some recruiting and an actual recruiter for a like tech company. They are joining us virtually to give some like resume reviews. I posted the link in the chat. Everybody in person, we can take a peek or whatever afterwards too. Feel free to come. It's virtual. You can like submit your resume if you want that to be like graded basically live, as well as like questions to get answered as well. It's a good opportunity to get some critiques and sort of hear where other people struggle that you might not have thought of. Yeah, that's happening Monday. Thursday, I think you're having, yeah, okay. Thursday, we're having a Python data structures and algorithms workshop. We started this last semester. but because of the winter break, we took a little hiatus, and now we are back. If you missed the first one, it's also posted on YouTube, but that's okay. It's as long as you really know Python stuff, you should be a-okay. And then finally, we're working on doing some team leak code stuff. So if you're interested in that, that should be coming not next week, but the week after. I think we're planning on doing some like teams, and then whoever can, like whatever team can, like get get the solution the quickest, gets like a point or win something or something. So yeah. Python workshop be online as well. So it will be a hybrid, right?
Yeah, hybrid.
Hybrid. Okay, yeah, hybrid. So both online and in person if you want to come in person. And usually with the in-person stuff, we have snacks and stuff too. Today we have cookies, but yeah, the more people that RSVP, the more like food and everything I will get as well. Awesome. Yes, and then I'll pass it back to you to finish this call.
Cool. And just for people who haven't been here, the room we use that does have like little pods. So for the leak code stuff, it'll be hopefully I'm really excited for it because I'm hoping it'll you have like your own TV to like brainstorm or whatever. And so it's not like we're not in like a traditional classroom. So I'm excited for that. Yeah, so that's the end of my workshop. Please, if you can, fill out the questionnaire. It will help me kind of plan for, help all of us really plan for future workshops and kind of gauge interest, as well as record how good this one was. Yeah, I'll still be on for a little while in case there's any questions. But yeah, thank you for attending. Hopefully you found it useful. And one thing in the survey, just to like really hype it, is I do ask like whether you want more like complex examples for the dev container stuff. I didn't, obviously it would have taken so long to like load here on my puny little laptop, but if you're interested, I could spend time like working to create like complex like dev work environments or stuff, or like showing how to like launch a desktop app with a dev container or something like that. So please let me know. And if you have any questions, please feel free to like post in the Discord. And if you're not in the Discord, please message us in the chat or something, or talk to us, and we'll set you up because I think there might be a few people not in the Discord yet. But yeah, otherwise, thank you all for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Okay.